Hi everybody, we are here at FutureNet to discuss about how networking is evolving towards the upper layers of the stack and how users and applications are becoming a fundamental element of those communications. With me today, I have four panelists, Allan, Pere, Michael, and John. Let's go through a round of introductions, please. Allan, do you want to start?
Yes, hi, my name is Allan Leinwand. I'm SVP of Engineering at Slack. We aim to make enterprise collaboration simpler, more productive, and more pleasant. Glad to be here.
Pere?
Hi, I'm Tara Hernandez, Senior Engineering Manager in Google Cloud Developer Platforms Engineering. We try to bring cloud joy to our developers on our platform.
John?
I'm John Pescatore. The fancy title I made up years ago when we had to do it for business cards is I'm the Director of Emerging Security Trends at the SANS Institute. We're the biggest cybersecurity training company.
Michael?
Hi, I'm Michael Payne here from JPMorgan Chase. I'm an engineer in our platform services group, and we are building the next generation cloud platforms for our internal application developers and teams.
That we are going to cover on how these transformations that we are experiencing in the industry are changing networking. To start, what we are seeing is like three areas. The first one, of course, is like the advent of multi-cloud. Applications are becoming more distributed, spread around the globe, and being accessed from everywhere. The second aspect, of course, is how users now working from home, working from different locations, offices, remote places, are transforming the way the flows of communications go and the experience that they are getting from those apps. And then, of course, the way how we develop applications is changing too. So we wanted to start with you, Pere. How do you see the role of developers and applications in this kind of network transformation and as we go towards the upper layers of the stack with the experience that the users expect?
Yeah, thanks, Pere. What we're seeing is an incredible explosion of modes of thought about software application development. You're thinking about globalization at levels where previously it would only be the largest companies who might be thinking about that. But you as a software development company or a division within an organization, network latency access, it really informs software architecture decisions. You need to bring those subject matter expertise practitioners into your organizations so that you can think about how you're designing software to take advantage of the fact that you can have global CDN. What can you cache to the edges? What can you do to ensure that mobile apps anywhere in the world are going to be able to access the data that they need in order for your service to thrive? And it really changes, I think, the old models in really interesting ways from those, big monolithic services that are sitting, squatting in some data center in the middle of the desert. And so the more that we have organizations that recognize that need to evolve to bring in those subject matter expertises around network configuration, optimization, around security policy, and how it fundamentally impacts architecture, the more successful businesses are going to be in the cloud.
So basically what you're saying is that somehow the network is not the responsibility of the infrastructure teams anymore, that networking and security is part of the whole process of development, right?
Absolutely. If you think about the old school model, you have your software developers in this magical restricted place behind the mystical firewall, and everything beyond the firewall was the domain of other people, right? We can't get away with those types of models anymore. Everything is intrinsically connected. And if you're at all interested in agile methodology or DevOps philosophy in organizational transformation, we talk about the concept of shifting left, and everything shifts left. The closer that we bring application development to real style production environments, the closer that we get them to customer experience, the more successful we're going to be in the modern era.
Good insights. And maybe shifting to you, Allan, basically what you are seeing from Pere, you have it at scale, right? So basically with Slack, you have not only the application elements that you are developing to provide an application to the users, but the fact that you have like all these millions and millions of users distributed around the world. What challenges do you see when you take those concepts that Pere was explaining at scale?
Yeah, thanks. It's very similar. What we've seen, Slack's a fairly modern application. It's a fairly young company. And obviously we're working on highly connected, large amounts of users that are doing collaboration in real time. So we think a lot about building services and building infrastructure that allows both things to happen at the edge, because we do run our own edge, as well as at the core of our network. We have a lot of our business logic that runs in our core. We have many different environments, and we need to make sure that, as Tara was talking about, we run that agile DevOps mentality. Here at Slack, if you build the service, you run it. So we have shifted left as far as you can possibly go. What that means is that the development teams now need to understand the architecture of what they're building. They need to understand what happens at the edge. They need to understand what happens at the core. They need to understand network latencies that could impact their service. And if you go back to the traditional world of building networks, you build networks with bandwidth you buy, fiber, network devices, data centers, et cetera. Those architectural models still exist within the cloud, but you need to understand there's different constraints, there's different limitations, there's different ways that the architecture has been built. And you need to understand those models all the way into the development team so they can build the services and build the applications. In our particular case, build those collaboration tools that really operate at just enormous scale. The other thing that you talked about briefly there was internationalization and regulation. And in our world, we've built something called international data residency. And the idea about IDR is you can store local data that pertains to your business, whether it's your message data or your channel names or some of your search histories. This data can be stored in local countries around the world because we are seeing large multinationals that are used to having network architectures, distributed data centers in many different countries, wanting that same premise in the cloud, regardless of how that cloud implementation has worked and regardless of the application. So we spend a lot of time building a global scale, distributing that network, combining the edge and the core, and then making sure we have sort of the compliance and regulation layer on top of that. If you think about what I just said, it's really nothing different from what we were doing 10 years ago. Before you're doing it in data centers with kit that you're buying, now you're doing it in the cloud. The architectural differences can be there, but at the very essence, you're still running in silicon and aluminum somewhere. So you still end up having to think about how do you impact the physical layer, even though you're dealing with the cloud, which is, not just hot and cold water vaporizing and making magic compute that shows up.
The compliance topic is very interesting, but before we go there, I have a question for you, Allan. So when you have all these millions of users with some sort of customer experience, how do you envision and how do you see the value of SLO monitoring and how the network connectivity kind of influence that?
Yeah, as you might imagine, we do a lot of it in Slack. So what we end up doing is we do have SLOs for each service. The service themselves and the service owners have alerts that come into a specific channel. And then those alerts can trigger automations and workflow. Within Slack, we have a workflow engine, and that workflow engine triggers and allows those teams to escalate those issues and run incidents and drive remediation. So to answer your question directly, we do have SLOs, we do have alerts and monitoring on those SLOs, and every service team that builds a service is responsible for their SLOs and keeping that availability, performance, security KPI, whatever the SLO is, up to date and informed.
And going back to the compliance and the local regulations, Michael at JPMC, you know a little bit about that, right? So from a financial point of view, you have some of Allan's problem and more, right? Could you tell us a little bit more about how do you see how these networking connectivity layers interface with all these regulations and how is the organization coping with it?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Pere. Thanks for having me. You're right. We do have a very sort of complicated regulatory environment, lots of overlapping regulators depending on the different types of lines of business and the application's been written. And so navigating that is quite difficult. Allan spoke about data residency. One of the key things for us is data isolation. So we can't, we run multi-tenant environments. We're mixing and matching applications from different lines of business. And so a key thing for us is how do we keep the data within those constraints isolated and apart from each other. And the benefit of the new cloud architectures is that we get a lot more visibility into the network. We get a lot more flexibility in terms of the network. The network gives us the opportunity to provide a more secure environment as well. So, for example, we can at a platform layer introduce things like denial networking and have teams adopt network policy. So they're much more thoughtful about what they can and can't talk to, and then on the back end of that, we get a lot more metrics and data about what is talking to what. Are there applications that are trying to talk to other things that they shouldn't be? Where are the network calls sort of failing and where are they bubbling up? So there's a lot more control, but there's also some complexity as well. And Allan mentioned this as well. We've got teams that have been running applications in traditional environments, whether it be bare metal servers, could be virtual machines. And what we're seeing is that those sort of simple environments where there's not many layers, you're essentially exposing an application or a port. Now you're bringing this into a more complicated cloud platform. You may have Kubernetes involved, and now you've got proxies and load balancers and ingress layers and different network layers. And that provides a lot of benefit in terms of better, things like retries and routing capabilities and load balancing algorithms, but it's also more layers. And so we're finding that teams are sometimes, there's a ramp up in terms of getting used to those layers, understanding what they mean, and leveraging them in a way that helps their application architecture. And we can also play back a lot more metrics to those teams as to what's happening at the network layer for their applications.
How do you view security? Is it something that basically happens, as Tara was mentioning, with the developers getting involved, or do we have to have separation of concerns? How do you view the securing all these systems?
Well, the dirty secret behind everything we do in security is 99% of what's being done and paid for in security is to make up for mistakes and sloppy processes by IT operations and developers. If there was no vulnerabilities if buffer overflows and race conditions and hidden capabilities and default passwords weren't being built into code, there'd be a lot less spending on security. If IT was patching faster when the vulnerabilities were discovered, there'd be a lot fewer attacks, less spent on security. So every time there's one of these transformations, you always cringe as a security person, because generally it means things get less mature. IT finally figured out how to do something, and now we're going to do it in the cloud and across multiple cloud systems, or we're going to do it a different way. So generally, when I hear complexity, when I hear shift left, generally that means we're going to do the same things we were doing. We'll probably do them faster, but we won't do them better. And we certainly saw that at the start of virtualization. We saw lots of badly configured server images spun up really, really quickly. In fact, I remember some of the earliest cloud service providers had been denial of service protection because of the sysadmin spinning up lots of servers and leaving them running. Now, this transformation, when I hear some differences, which I have a lot of hope for. So when I hear the DevOps focus, typically over the years, IT's been driven to reduce cost, homogenize everything. Everything must be the same, must change at the same intervals. And the focus is on reducing maintenance costs, not on delighting the user. So when I hear there's more of a focus on the user, we are starting to see software architects consider privacy to be one of their functional requirements. Privacy being baked in, we're starting to see how, well, wait a minute, the customer is not only going to be using a Windows PC, they're going to be using lots of different devices and services. So our solutions, our applications have to work across that. We better think about building in identity. We better think about building in ways to do encryption. So starting to see those very key areas of protecting the information in this sort of transformation be more important. Now, under the covers, as we heard several times here, the things about performance and about the trustability of the services that are transferring that information back and forth and across multiple clouds and multiple applications, there's still a lot of keep the wheels on, I call it. Still a lot of heavy lifting of security operations and what smells very much like traditional IT and network operations to make sure it's not just delights the user, but it's also reliable enough to meet the demand.
When we talk about identity and how enabling encryption between service and service-to-service authentication authorization, how do you see this in development teams? Do you think that this is part of how you embed certificates into applications, or do you decouple into new areas like service meshes, and then is the platform team? How do you see the responsibilities as we get into these requirements that John is laying out?
Right. Well, I want to touch on something that Allan mentioned that I thought was a great sort of a great juxtaposition, because I think when we think about in my world we think about organizational modernization beyond application modernization, right? The whole org needs to be in a particular mindset. And to Allan's point, it is absolutely true. If you have an organization that already has pretty good software architecture around latency, performance, network configurations, the shift to the cloud is amazingly easy. I worked at an organization where the latency problems were so bad between the application services and the data store that they not only had to be in the same rack, that there had to be an actual direct network coupling, not even through the appliance. And that was a sin that was sort of obscured by the operations team that was not exposed to the software development. So there's a cultural element that I think is super critical to all of this. So if you're like Slack, relatively new, had a stronger investment to engineering excellence and architectural excellence, for lack of a better word, these transitions are not nearly as big. If you are a big legacy organization with a lot of cultural inertia around what particular teams are responsible for, right, then that's when things really get interesting. So are you as an organization willing to make the investment to bring in the domain experts that you need? Are the software architects willing to accept the input from these new domain experts, right? So to me, ultimately, this all comes back down to how do you organize your people? And the technology then should just fall out from how the organization chooses to arrange themselves. So whether you choose to do a service mesh, I think shouldn't be the driver, it should be the outcome, right? And similar to other types of technology choices. So for me, my big thing is how do the people organize around the technology? And I think that if an organization has modernization that they want to achieve, they really have to start with that. What is their business value? What are the outcomes they need to drive? Based on those outcomes, then you start making the technical choices and the architectural decisions that you need in order to meet those.
As we go from a well-understood network definition of IP addresses, DNS names, and so on, and now we get into this shift left. We are talking about identities at multiple levels, from certificates to authentication authorization of applications themselves and identity of end users. We are going to multi-cloud environments, and you represent kind of like very advanced organizations in terms of talent and budget, in terms of the importance of the digital infrastructure for your business. First, my question would be, how do you see this transformation of the teams evolving to understand and organizing towards these concepts? But second, how do you see companies that are not as lucky as you in terms of the talent that you have in order to drive that transformation? How would you advise them to start? And maybe, I don't know, we can start by Tara and then Michael and Allan.
Well, there's a couple of ways. One, you want to get to the point where any policy that you have or any production configuration that is deemed to be super critical, you build infrastructure around that to create the guardrails for your development team, so that even if one individual developer might not understand all of the nuances of what is being constrained, they at least have a test to tell them that the check-in that they're about to commit is going to blow things up, and so their pull request is going to get denied, right? So there's that element. And then as far as bringing in domain expertise, there's a variety of ways. One, you either got to be willing to pay for it and bring in someone who knows what they're doing. You need to be willing to invest in your employee base to send them to training, their certifications, right? Or, a lot of companies will outsource it and try and figure out to solve a particular problem as kind of a first step, and then try and figure out where to go next. But it's something from a strategic standpoint you have to solve. If you don't solve this critical need, your business is just going to kind of fade out, if not just fall and burn. Right. So whatever you need to be able to do, you got to pick some mechanism that needs you to get there, because you're not going to be able to ignore it. Right. The first time you run up against a GDPR violation, the EU is just going to shut you down. They're not going to accept your excuses that you couldn't hire a good network and security team. Right. That's not how this works.
Michael, how do you see it from a transformation within your company? And then how do you advise other companies to do it?
The first one is just education. So we're really trying to push people to go and get their cloud certifications, and working through organizations like the CNCF on training credits and programs and these sort of things. That's been really helpful. We're trying to encourage broader participation, which is also a cultural challenge, because typically banks have been very insular and are reluctant to engage in things like open source communities. But we're trying to encourage greater participation in things like CNCF and open source projects. And one of the really interesting things for us has been sort of more hands-on type events. So we've got a concept called Cloud Party, and it's where we bring together internal teams from all different lines of business, and they spend in between like 2 to 3 days And we then send the experts in, so the people that are running the platforms and building the architecture, and we sit side by side with the architecture teams, and they have a goal. They're trying to get an application that's not running on the cloud platforms across to the cloud platform, or they're trying to do a protocol uplift or change the architecture to be more microservices. And that's been really popular. So it's a very large time investment on both sides, but the outcomes are great. So we get teams with hands-on experience. The other thing we did investment-wise, which has also been very successful, is client engagement teams. So we've got like a smaller number of teams that smaller number of resources that actually exist only to really help customers onboard and follow best practices. So they're not part of the platform team or the software application teams, but they understand those systems and they help people on board. And that's been another sort of really key thing. So it's really multifaceted. You can't just do one of these things. Back in pre-COVID, in the last in-person Kubernetes conference, there was a presentation. I can't remember who it was from, but they spoke about this period that they called tough sledding, like a really hard sort of 9-month period as the community sort of upskilled and got better at these sort of systems and platforms and networks. And as the community grew, collectively, everyone sort of got better at this. There was less adoption of anti-patterns and more self-help and better sharing as well. So I think we're sort of in that period at the moment. But we're fortunate enough to be able to invest there and help people along.
And Allan, from your side, probably you started kind of as a more modern methodology, Slack by being newer, but the world is changing very fast, right? So within probably the relatively short history of Slack, you've already seen a variety of transformations. So how do you address the change and what do you advise other companies to do?
Yeah, we address the change because, as you can imagine, Slack is just turned 7. So we're a relatively young company and our product is still scaling and evolving. We have done some of the things that Tara mentioned before. We've shifted left. We have something called security development lifecycle, an SDL process that gets teams involved, thinking about security, thinking about identity, thinking about preventing various attack vectors early on in the code development process and the product development process. And then as we roll things out, we have security reviews, we have delivery reviews. So we have processes in place to sort of be those speed bumps as people start to deploy their product or their service to make sure that we have all the security, all the identity, all the access control, the encryption, the international data residency, all those things need to be considered. People think of Slack as a simple messaging platform, but it's far from that. It's a workflow collaboration tool that takes tens of millions of users at the same time and allows them to collaborate in real time. And that's a very interesting real-time distributed system. And you can imagine that the surface layer of that, whether it's on a Windows box or Mac OS or Android device or iOS device, is broad. So we need to think about security. We need to think about the network architecture that those security practices live in. And we need to think about architecting that early on in the product and early on in the service. Because if we don't, we'll end up with what John was mentioning, people coming in afterwards and having lots and lots of cleanup to do on the security side. And the last thing we want to do is let our particular application or let our services be an attack vector. It's something we think long and hard about. We run red team experiments. We run various other sorts of testing and procedures and poking and prodding. We're involved in lots of open source projects as well as security events to make sure Slack is as secure as possible. So this sort of built into our blood. And like you said, Pere, it's sort of part of our nature because we're a younger company that we're sort of born into this world. We're not trying to pick up the days of running checkpoint firewalls and now adopt them to the cloud. We were born into this, and we're trying to figure out how do we leverage everything we know from the past and apply it to the new paradigm that is a cloud service.
Tara, when you have a developer that has to code against the user experience and the users basically are annoyed of some of those things, like how do you see the tension between the convenience and the security, and how is it solved from your point of view?
Yeah, right. Thanks, Pere. I think John is absolutely right. I mean, users, consumers, definitely, they do want security, right? They want to feel secure. But there's that balance that as application developers that we have to strike between security and usability. I have 6, 7 financial services apps on my iPhone, and I have 2FA or Face ID or whatever it is in order to keep the security. But every single one of those apps has a little checkbox that says, trust this device, trust this browser, basically disable that security after the first time. I would love to see stats on how many consumers actually do that, because that actually tells us as an industry how much tolerance consumers have for good security best practices. And so to me, the interesting thing looking forward is how can we continue to grow the technology such that we get the same level of security as a 2FA or a Face ID or all those other extra steps that we currently have to do, but reduce the actual user experience as much as possible. That's, I think, to me, a little bit of the holy grail from the application standpoint. Not quite sure what that's going to look like, though.
Yeah, definitely, and it changes, jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But I just wanted to switch a little bit and turn this internally. So our internal application development teams, it's been super interesting along the same lines that Tara mentioned, that as we have these new cloud platforms, we've turned on more control at a platform level. So in the past, you could have your application talk to any other application and it's basically an open network. And now it's not. So now you have to be very thoughtful and you need to know what you're talking to on what port. And the amount of pushback we got when we introduced this was huge. And there was all these arguments about developer productivity and, can't you just turn it off in dev and then turn it on for test and prod? And we really pushed back really hard on this. And we said, no, like perfect practice makes perfect. You can't not do this in dev and then, have it work in test and prod. So we have to turn it on everywhere. And it was really fascinating. So at first it was just moaning and whining and escalations and managing directors coming at us saying, you're harming our productivity. And now it's just an accepted part of what we do. And it's been really fascinating to see how that's worked. And we've really had to hold firm on this and say, no, we have to have this hygiene and this practice in all the environments all the time. And we're not going to back off. So it's been interesting. And maybe we do that with end users, Tara, with our banking customers. That'll be a harder argument.
But I wish you the best of luck.
So it's very understand that you are not going out of business anytime soon. You'll keep consulting and giving advice on how to solve problems for a while.
Well, and the key thing, my recommendation to the IT industry and the banking industry is stop blaming the users for this. Tara, it's not that the users wouldn't do this. It's that in the banking world, they wouldn't agree on a common form of authentication because they didn't want to get anybody in between the customer and them. So they all want to register the customer locally. Google and Microsoft and AOL and Sun before them fought these identity battles. So we did not have an easy to use way that a customer could have an identity that they could use across multiple services. It's not been their fault. It's not been the user's fault. They're perfectly happy with keeping their cell phone number. When they change phone vendors, the same number, I can use it on AT&T and iPhone and everywhere I go. I've had the same telephone number for 20 years. And guess what? Now for two-factor authentication, you guys are using that number to prove it's me. Yet you've made it difficult in Google and Microsoft and banking services for users to achieve what the cell phone industry agreed on years ago, and made it easy. And the IT industry is not doing that very well.
Allan, Slack seems a little bit like less sensitive from a security point of view, but I would say yesterday I started sharing PowerPoint presentations over Slack that contain quarter information. So how do you see a Slack evolution from being part of those discussions and the data that you carry becoming sensitive and users as me bypassing completely the intended use of Slack and abusing in a way that is probably not conducive to security? What are you going to do on those topics?
Yeah, I kind of disagree with you, Pere. I mean, we think that is a intended use of Slack. We don't have problem people sharing files and sharing information. Slack is a collaboration tool. It collaborates across workflows. It collaborates with bots. It collaborates with files. It collaborates with links. So yeah, there's quite a lot that happens within Slack, and we take security very, very seriously. We have encryption. We do multi-factor. Excuse me. We do multi-factor, not single factor. Yeah, we have lots of different ways we can store data for data residency issues. We have compliance audits, and we take security incredibly seriously. And we make sure that our customers understand the security implications, because Slack is is an application, and Slack is a platform that people use to share lots and lots of confidential information.
So Pere, let me agree with what Allan just said. When users resort to social media to share, that's a failure of the IT organization to give them a safe way to do what they need to do. Dropbox exploded not because people were trying to get around security rules. It was the only way they could access their work data from an iPhone, a Windows PC, and something else. The old example I used to use here is colleges long ago learned we don't try to put fences up to force the students to stay on the sidewalks. If they're going to walk diagonally across the grass, let's pave the damn grass, because that's what the users need to do, get from here to there. Let's make it safe for them to do so versus try to force them the way we think it should happen. And all too often, the focus on IT is do it easier for IT, not help the user achieve what they need to be done. Users want to be safe. And if we build it in, watching what they do and make what they're doing safe versus saying, let's force them into our way of doing it, then better thing. I'd rather see it go over Slack than go through corporate email.
And John, is this a love battle? Because if you think, we keep thinking communications and networking as the way to secure systems, but the Slack example is a perfect one. I create a Slack channel with data that happens to be in a different organization as mine. And I just do a mistake and drop a PowerPoint with financial information to the wrong Slack channel. And happens that this pops up. So essentially what we are seeing is that this notion of saying, oh, I'm protected because I'm adding TLS and encryption and so on. When do we shift towards understanding what the user is doing and what the data that I'm transmitting towards the destination? Because this is going to be fundamental, regardless of what level, if it's IP, TLS, Slack. All these are communication channels that connect users with other users and exchange data. So are we approaching it right, or should we approach it in a different way?
This always gets back to having trustable identities. That's the only way to do it. How did you know it was really Tara on the Slack channel? You had to have some out-of-band way of doing that. On the telephone system, we sort of have telephone numbers we can sort of trust, even though, unfortunately, we can't trust them fully. It always does get back to identity. And that's not a problem in some countries where they have national digital identities. In the United States and most of Europe, we don't have that. And the IT industry has been very slow to address that problem and try to solve that. It gets back to we resorted to encrypting bits in motion. TLS and all that stuff came about because that was easier than attacking the problem of persistently encrypting data.
And with John's comment about how do we change and perceive networking in a much more generic way, from how users connect, authenticate, how data residency problems, how do we connect across this distributed wall, and how do we detect attacks and elements about security, we conclude. And it's been very exciting to see how the panelists have debated about how the transformation, shift left, and agility brings all these challenges together.